Here at the Brighter Ministry, we want to liberate, encourage, and bless you on your journey. But nothing we share here is meant to be medical advice. Please find the care of your own local healthcare providers to guide you in your decision making.
Well, welcome back to the Brighter podcast. Today is a special interview that we have with Becky Mathieu. We're really excited for this. This is part of our season 2 for the podcast, where we're going to be doing a lot of interviews and testimonies and branching out into lots of different specific topics beyond the overarching truth of the gospel. We want to really touch on some of these more specifics that everybody is wondering about. So today we have a special guest, Becky Mathieu. She's a child and youth worker, a registered psychotherapist for children's mental health services, and an after-hours on-call chaplain. She is just fantastic. We had a wonderful interview with her. We spent a whole hour in this great discussion. And at the end of the hour, we felt like we could have gone going for another 20 hours because there are just so many facets of this conversation that are worth discussing and unfolding. So today for you, we have part 1 of this conversation. It's the first section of our discussion where we really talk more practical things. What might be behind your child's behavior? What is normal for children and what isn't normal, and how can we tell the difference, and where does that discernment come in? And we talk a little bit about Becky's experiences and how it is that she can understand families and whatever it is that you might be going through. So parents and anyone who has children in their life, this episode is especially for you. We know you're going to get a ton out of it. We're so excited about this conversation, and you're definitely going to want to pop your headphones in, grab a coffee if you're hitting the road, turn the volume up, and maybe even take notes when you can, because Becky has a lot of really great information and encouragement for you in this episode. All right, enjoy. In this world, we face hard things. For some of us, the hardest stuff exists within ourselves, as we or someone we know grapples with mental illness.
We believe there's great hope and power in the gospel of Christ, and that this hope and power can defeat all darkness, even the most eluding and treacherous kinds.
If you've ever wondered where God could be in all of the loneliness, confusion, and difficulty, stick around.
Here, we share practical and spiritual truths from the Bible and our own lives to help you navigate through whatever you may be facing.
We believe that wherever you are in your journey, Jesus can make it brighter. Becky, we are so happy to have you here on the podcast. Laura, you and I are welcoming Becky Mathieu this morning onto the Brighter podcast, and we've already been chatting here for a while just about kind of what you do and a little bit about your experiences, and even just with Open Door and the teachings that we've been sharing and what you know. But I guess before we get started, would you like to just share a little bit about yourself for anyone listening who doesn't know you?
Sure. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So I have worked in children's mental health for 21 years. I have been at a mental health facility for kids and their families for those 21 years. And I've also worked in custody and for other organizations as well. We also talked about how I had the opportunity to become a chaplain for the hospitals, which I try to bring into my mental health experience as well, and working with them.
That's great. And you're at Open Door, is that right?
I am, yes. Yeah. I've been there for about just over 4.5 years now. I used to attend Gateway, and then when I married Mike, we left that up to God, where he wanted us to land, and I knew pretty quickly he was prompting me to come to Open Doors. So
amazing.
It's been great to be there as well.
Yeah, we're so blessed to have you there in the community, and Mike is just such a sweetheart. Anyone who knows Mike Mathieu, yeah, it's just he's a really great part of the community too. Yeah. So you guys are quite the team.
Yeah, thank you. It's
been
fun.
Yeah. So why don't we get started with like, what are some of the most common issues? So today, the topic is children's mental health, equipping parents, but also just getting more into the topic. We have not covered this at all on the podcast. And I know there are some parents who listen, sometimes parents of adult children, parents of young children. And of course, the whole time that we've been doing this, we're still in the middle here of the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada and globally. As we're recording this, it's August 2021. So this has been a topic on a lot of people's hearts, especially parents. I know educators as well. The world has been keeping an eye on children and just seeing the effects of this, but it's also bringing to light just some issues that were already existing pre-COVID and pre-lockdowns and pre all the, all these big things that have put it in the spotlight. So I guess before all of this change, what were some of the most common issues that you were seeing children facing in our community and in the area?
Well, when we think about mental health, I mean, there's so many different areas in mental health. To cover all of it would probably take a very long time.
Yes.
So primarily, I work with kids that have anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, trichotillomania, Tourette syndrome, rage disorders. So that's kind of my area. Now, we also know that there's the developmental disabilities, there's autism spectrum disorder, there's mood, different mood diagnoses. So there's lots of different ones. So being that I do work with kids that have a lot of the different anxiety disorders, needless to say, with the pandemic, that has just skyrocketed. Even kids that maybe weren't struggling with their mental health in quite the same way, because of the pandemic, we certainly saw lots of changes. We saw big spikes in anxiety. We saw, symptoms increasing. It was just a culmination of so many different things that were creating crises in a lot of people. So that's kind of the areas that we've really started to see and how it's been impacted by the pandemic.
And what's different about children and mental health and adults? Like an anxiety disorder in a child, does that manifest very differently than it does in grown-ups, as I say always to my kids?
In ways, yes. But I think probably some of the biggest piece that we do a lot of education around is a misinterpretation of what we're seeing. So very often, kids that have, anxiety or OCD or Tourette syndrome or sensory processing dysfunction or all the different things that would impact daily functioning, it can appear very behavioral. It can almost appear very purposeful. It can appear that they're choosing to do certain things or avoiding certain behaviors. So until we really have an understanding of what's going on, kids are labeled all kinds of things, often, not with any kind of ill intention, but just not knowing what's really going on, because kids also have a harder time explaining what's going on. They can't say, I've been really experiencing these anxious symptoms lately. I think something's off. I could really use some help. What you're seeing are outbursts, meltdowns, crying, avoidant behavior. There's a lot of those things that we typically see that could, again, be misinterpreted as other things. We often say kids do well if they can, not if they want to. That's something Dr. Ross Greene says. He's certainly somebody that we use in our treatment. And
can you say that again?
Absolutely. It's kids do well if they can, not if they want to. So if they're not doing well, something's getting in the way. So every behavior has a function and a purpose. So you actually end up doing a lot of detective work to figure out what is going on here. And if the output isn't matching what we know they could be capable of, to us, that means we need to do some work here to find out what's really at the root of it all.
So what are some maybe examples of concerning output that you might see? Like, I think of kids that, are refusing to go to school and saying that they have tummy aches or headaches all the time. just knowing kind of my professional background and when I've worked with kids, that would be like a common thing that you would have to kind of, where is that coming from? So what kind of other examples or things might be good for parents to maybe watch out for?
Sure. That's actually a great example, because very often anxiety does, present as, physical. It does affect the physical body. So yes, there's headaches, there's tummy aches, or if it's that I'm very afraid that I don't want to do something, then I will try to avoid it. Very often we tend to recognize more of that anxious behavior when it's that inward, it's the crying, it's the avoidant behavior. But what we know about anxiety is our responses to that, children or adults, are fight, flight, or freeze. So we often forget the fight part is actually anxiety, can be very much anxiety driven. So when we see the outbursts, when we see the screaming, the yelling, the just full-on meltdowns because of a simple request.
That's the fight response.
That's the fight response. And, that could be, we often hear, it's conduct disorder, it's oppositional, it's these things. But when we start to do a little bit more kind of digging, it's at the root of it. Often there can be things like anxiety or sensory processing dysfunction, that where we can't, we're either hyper or hypo stimulated to sounds or smells or sights or proprioceptive input, which is where we understand our kind of physical space and needing more input into our muscles, or our vestibular that is required for balance. So you might see we'll only wear certain clothing, avoiding tags or socks, or big responses to certain sounds or smells, or and it's just, where did that come from? That would indicate something could be going on.
I'm just going to slow down a little bit and go back to what you said about fight, flight, or freeze as kind of instinctual responses from children.
Yes.
And what they may be indicating.
Yeah.
And I hear my parent voice in my head, because I've got 2 young kids, and I have a son who is a very sensitive person, right? I don't think he has anything going on beyond that. He's just very sensitive. And his response is often fight. But now I'm also kind of in my mind hearing what would be maybe a common thread that parents think is, well, even if something's going wrong and that's how they're responding, it doesn't mean the behavior's okay. I still have to discipline the behavior and come down hard on that, because
they need to stop it and know it's not okay.
Yeah, the fit is not okay. The hitting is not okay, or the aggression or the response is not okay. Therefore, my response to my child's output is going to match it, almost to try and bring the behaviors down, because even if there's something going on, that's what I'm going to address that. Right. And so I imagine that maybe some parents are thinking that, and how do you address that response of like still needing discipline and still needing that training while also addressing a child's heart and the way that they're really doing.
Right. So regardless of why the behavior is happening, if there's a behavior that can't be happening, sometimes some of the behaviors escalate to dangerous situations or ones that are just not acceptable. No matter why it's happening, if it has to change, it has to change. What we start to look at is, where is it coming from? Because that's going to help us know how to help them change it. So kids that don't have certain diagnoses, or they're able to process a lot of these things on their own, they have the skill to do that. Simple, consequences or rewards are usually enough. So they can pull on hindsight to determine forethought. They can remember, I didn't like what happened when I did that last time, so I'm going to do something different. Or, I really like that reward I got, I'm going to try to get that again. And that's enough to help mold that behavior. Kids that are struggling with a lot of these different mental health disorders, they don't have the skills or abilities to do that yet. So we need to teach them that. So it's not that rewards and consequences don't have a place. we just have to build in that skill building component to it so that they can, practice it over and over again till it becomes rote, till it's something that they no longer have to think about. So it's predictable, so that, there's structure and routine and all of those things that will help them thrive. Because they don't have what we say the braking system in their brain to do that yet. So they're not going to be able to remember. They'll be able to tell you every single rule. They're going to say, if I do this, it's going to happen. If I do this, I'm going to happen. But in the moment, they don't have the braking system required to be able to activate that when needed. And when we think of things like frustration tolerance, understanding myself and others, talking to other people, being able to sit still in situations where that's required. We often think that that's just kind of innate or inherent, and all kids kind of have that ability and they'll be able to do that. But not all kids do. So they might need extra help in order to do that. So it's really just about understanding the behavior to know how to help them change that which is not acceptable. Yeah. And sometimes there's specific treatments that we need to do. I want to back up a little bit to it and just say, often, like when we're talking about a lot of these things, it could be like, oh my goodness, my kid does that. Do they have anxiety?
Right.
Or, oh, my kid, they were lining things up. Do they have obsessive compulsive disorder?
I was just thinking that because you just said, the output's not changing, even though the consequences are consistent and make sense. And I'm thinking, well, okay, so then people listening might think, my child is continuing to have outbursts. Right. Does that mean that they have something that needs to be addressed? Right.
And so when I think back when I was first in school and we're learning all the different, diagnoses in the DSM, it would have been the DSM-4 at the time. I walked away from it going, oh my goodness, I have everything.
Yeah.
I think I'm everything. Like, I'm in trouble here. And it's kind of funny because when you look at things like that in isolation, it's like, a lot of people can have a lot of different flavors of a lot of different things for multiple different reasons. Criteria for the specific disorders. So an anxiety disorder, because you can be anxious without having an anxiety disorder. Right. Coming here to prepare for the podcast, and is something new. Having a healthy level of anxiety is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean I have an anxiety disorder. Mm-hmm. Or you might see kids that are responding to events. Maybe there was a death in the family or something that's happened, and I think they're depressed, or maybe they have bipolar or something, or no, maybe they're struggling, they're in grief kind of thing. So just because we're seeing symptoms doesn't necessarily mean it's a full-on diagnosis. There are specific criteria that has to be met for a certain amount of time that can't be better explained by something else. Right. And the person to do that is the doctor. So my first thing to say is don't self-diagnose. Don't diagnose your child. Now some of these approaches work with all kids, and that's great. But for certain things, if you're starting to wonder and question, say, this seems like it might be going on a little bit more. Maybe there's something else going on. Then I would just talk to your doctor about it, and they would be the ones that would be able to either diagnose them themselves or send them to somebody that would do that. Right. Exactly.
So it's kind of the same. Well, it is the same as with adults in that we talked about this in our past last season, where you might notice, certain situations bring out things that technically are symptoms of specific disorders. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have that disorder. But over time, if you're noticing these and certain patterns of it coming up, and certain techniques aren't helping it, then that's when it becomes maybe look into that. It kind of goes back that we used a stomachache analogy of notice it over time, doesn't get better, it's actually getting worse, and
and it's impairing function. Mm-hmm. This is something we talked about a lot, and I think this is something that's on people's minds, parents' minds, and just people's minds in general about themselves, because we are in a stage right now with the mental health conversation culturally here in Canada, I can speak for, where it is in the spotlight a bit media, with social media, and it kind of is in people's faces. And it is popular, I would say, to claim over yourself or your child a certain disorder because you're seeing that. And based on what you know, that's the label that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, that there's a range of normal, just as you've said, and we all hit markers on that range of normal over different parts of our life.
Yeah.
And what might look like a disorder, even for a period of time, a couple months, maybe even, could just be part of that normal range for us.
Absolutely.
Based on our situation, based on what's going on biologically. You know, I think of mothers and children and different stages of development and things like, or even just aging, you know, the process of aging and how it impacts our mental health. And it does take some intuition to really to navigate when you need help or when your child might need help. And it's something that it's always on parents' minds, you know, do I need more here?
That's right.
Or am I addressing this enough? Am I letting my child, you know, go too far without getting the help that they need?
That's right.
Or the opposite might be denial and thinking, no, they're fine. This is a behavior thing. And not really having that kind of red flag come up in their minds, thinking, oh, wait, maybe this is something else that's going on. And they're not, like you said, they're not choosing this because, as you said, children do well if they can, not if they want to. Exactly. Yeah. I think that might be something we share a lot as in this conversation. Children do well if they can, not if they want to. And
you're right too. Sorry to interrupt there. Even just the understanding of the developmental delay versus a developmental disability, because like you said, we're on a spectrum, you know, so if you were to walk into any kindergarten class, let's say, there's going to be kids that can count to 10. There's going to be kids that can't count at all yet. There's going to be kids that can tie their shoes. There's going to be kids that can't. There's going to be kids that are still melting down. There's going to be kids that appear quite mature. That's normal, you know, because we're still in that developing, functioning ability. But if we go into the grade 6 class and there's still kids that can't count to 10 and they're still melting down and, you know, kind of functioning in that area, the gap is starting to widen and things are starting to become obvious. That's often when we start to say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, there's certainly some diagnoses that are quite obvious from a young age, but a lot of them, you know, the onset of it or the ability to even diagnose doesn't come until later. They won't diagnose 2-year-olds with certain things because it's like, well, that could just be their developing kind of norms, you know? So
and
it is a lot of that too.
There's a lot of a danger also in diagnosing young children because typically diagnoses, they stick around, right? So once you get that, it's really hard to remove that. And then this child can just be completely ostracized based on this huge diagnosis that could it could have just been a delay, and it takes a bit of time for them to learn that social skill.
Well, and it shifts the parent's mindset too.
Completely,
right?
yeah.
And I'm just, as you're talking about a kindergarten class, like this is my bread and butter. Today I am the mother of an almost 4-year-old, almost 2-year-old, and we're about to expect newborn twins. Right. So this is like in my face day in and day out, and my friends who are mothers are there too. And I have friends who are looking at their 18-month-old thinking, I think I'm looking at autism because they aren't speaking yet. Or, you know, I've got friends who are looking at their 4-year-old or 5-year-old and saying, well, they're not interested in reading. I think something's wrong. Or they've got that kind of base level of waiting for something to be wrong and not sure when the time is right to check in on those things. And like you said, Laura, a diagnosis at an early age isn't always the answer because it might not be correct. So what would you say to like young worried parents or parents who have friends who are worried? Yeah.
And that's probably a really difficult place to be in because you want the best for your child and you're wondering and you see this. And so the first thing I say is take a breath. I often say, in talking to parents, and sometimes we kind of run that risk of over pathologizing things where it's like, oh, I think this means they have this, or I think, and sometimes even I'll be, working with families and they'll do this. And what do you think is going on here? And this just happened. I'm like, I know exactly what's going on. Like, what? You have a teenager. And they're like, oh, right. Okay. So some of that stuff is normal. And they just need to know that some of this stuff is just normal. If the child is quite young and you are having concerns, as much as possible, don't panic, monitor, talk to your doctor, and they'll be the ones to identify if there's really something going on. A young child not quite interested in reading yet kind of falls within the typical norms, maybe they're just not there yet. They want to be up a tree or they want to be out on their bike or, because, kids enjoy different things at different times as well. Or, somebody that's even struggling to talk or their speech isn't quite where you see other kids in that range. They might just need a little bit of extra help. And then they're completely fine. We've had kids that, they go to a speech pathologist that helps them start the talking, and then that's it. There's no other long-term effects that come with that. They needed a little bit of extra help. There's no, diagnoses or anything like that. Pray. Ask God, should I be worried here? Is there something I need to do here? And if he tells you no.
I'm just thinking, whenever we pray, should I be worried here, Lord? I'm pretty sure it's gonna be, don't worry about anything.
That's right. So
that can be hard for a parent to hear.
Hard.
Don't
and it's
worry.
not necessarily don't worry, just don't do anything. Yeah.
Yes, I know what you're getting at. That is going to be the crux of this conversation. I've been waiting for this to come.
Yeah.
The fear of parents, the fear and anxiety and just plain worry that parents have over their children's well-being, that wanting the best for them, especially in our circumstances here in Canada. We do have a lot of privileges at our fingertips. You kind of can see this beautiful life of opportunity for your child.
Yeah, we're talking about child mental health treatment, which is something that, I think a lot more of it could happen in Canada, but that is something that is just not even a conversation at all in a lot of places.
Absolutely.
And there is that level of worry and anxiety that people have here over these issues, and just over their children in general. I think when we even just get back to parenting, period, that's part of this conversation too, is just that fear over your child that, if they do, I'm thinking of the mom of the 18-month-old, if they do have autism, it means this, and this.
Right.
And that's going to affect
their
our life.
Yeah. Is going to look
our
like
life as a family. And it means constant appointments. It means therapies. It means they won't be able to access this part of the world's opportunities, and just having that kind of fear. And as we know, and you just said pray, but when we get right back down to the gospel, what does the gospel have to say to parents for that? And you know, because I see you sitting there and our listeners can't see you, but you have this level of peace as you're just talking about this stuff. And it's probably the piece of so much experience and just seeing things work out over and over and over again, where, a parent doesn't necessarily have that perspective, but there's also the peace that comes with the gospel. Why don't you share kind of how that affects your work? Having the peace of the gospel.
Yeah, I don't know that I could be the therapist that I am without that, to be honest. Again, I've worked in different environments. I've worked in, custody. I've worked in residential for years, inpatient, outpatient. And it wasn't until I really started to bring God into my work. It's like sometimes we're like, okay, this is the area I'm trained in, so I know what I'm doing. And God, I'll call on you for the things that maybe stump me a little bit. But when I started to realize, oh my word, I need you in all of it. And you know what? So do my clients. And even if they don't know you, I do. And I can pray for them, and I can pray for peace in those homes. And I can pray over them. That really started to shift things. And it is not to minimize the grief that happens when there's a diagnosis. There's a grief of the dreams you may have had. I'm not removed from this personally as well. I have family members and that have kids with autism, and on several actually, all kind of on different areas of the spectrum. I get it. not from a parent perspective, but I see the journey, and, you know, I get to hug and hold those sweet babies and kids, and they're precious, you know, but there is a grieving that comes from that. And that's okay too, because God will be in the middle of that as well. We actually have a resource that we give out to our families. It was actually written by I believe it was a mom of a child who was diagnosed with autism, but we use it for some of our other diagnoses as well, because it really is just so fitting. And it's called Welcome to Holland. I can share that resource with you as well too, but it's just, and you can even Google it if anybody's listening wants to look at that. But it talks about how you've prepared for this trip to Italy, and you're so excited. You've learned the language, you have the money, you've spent years preparing for this. You get in the plane, this is going to be life-changing, and the plane lands and they say, welcome to Holland. And you're like, wait, what? I'm supposed to be in Italy right now. And there's no way out. You don't know the language. You don't have the right currency. But this is now your home. This is where you're going to be. And it's devastating in the beginning, because you're like, I'm not prepared for this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. I can't even communicate with people. But then it goes on to say, but after a while, you start to see the beauty of Holland. You start to look around and see the windmills, and as you start to settle in your life there. And it's just a really powerful. Families have said that it's been just even a powerful thing for them to read for those kids that do have the diagnoses that are tough, you know, whether it's autism, Tourette syndrome, anxiety disorders, you know, any of that. You weren't ready for that. Nobody plans for that, nor should they, you know. Yeah. But once you're in it, God is so right in the center of that.
Oh, he's in Holland too.
He's absolutely, he created Holland, you know, and he created Holland to be beautiful, you know. And so many times I find those kids are teaching us lessons, you know, that are just so, so precious. So when we think about the don't fear, it's not about you're never going to feel fear, you know, but it's moving forward in the face of that, knowing that there is hope and there's help. So should you face a diagnosis of that kind, which is really tough, there's people to help. There's professionals that will help. There's organizations that can help. There's resources that, you know, can get into your hands. You won't be doing it alone.
Thanks for joining us for our part 1 of our conversation with Becky Mathieu today. Don't forget to tune in next week to hear part 2 of our conversation, where we're going to discuss more specifically how Jesus can meet us where we're at in the midst of any of our difficulties. Until then, we hope that you've been encouraged. Take care.